Remind those close to you to share responsibly or face the consequences. This kind of language gets overused, but this stuff is genuinely Orwellian and dystopian. The United Kingdom is descending into disturbing dystopian new levels of censorship amid ongoing riots and uprising, and we're going to break down what's happening in this episode of the Bread vs. Everyone podcast, my show where I take on the craziest ideas from across our politics and across the internet, all from a center-right, independent perspective. If you're new here, please do consider subscribing and sticking around. I would love to hit 150,000 subscribers before the end of the month, before the end of the summer. And regardless, do remember to hit that like button and do comment with your thoughts as we go along. I do read the comments and I pick a few to respond to in every episode. Now, without further ado, let's talk about what's going down in the UK. Think before you post. That's the chilling message, a verbatim quote that was just put out from the official social media accounts of the United Kingdom government. Amid these ongoing riots and uprisings started originally as part of anti-immigration protests, the government's posts warned citizens, even the ones who weren't involved, that they could be arrested just for their speech. Content that incites violence or hatred isn't just harmful, it can be illegal. The Crown Prosecution Service, which prosecutes crime in the UK, posted in a tweet. The CPS takes online violence seriously and will prosecute when the legal test is met. Remind those close to you to share responsibly or face the consequences. Oh. And guys, these are not just idle threats. Stephen Parkinson, the Director of Public Prosecutions of England and Wales, warned that they have dedicated police officers who've been tasked with scouring social media to follow up with identification and arrests when people, quote, publish or distribute material which is insulting or abusive, which is intended to or likely to start racial hatred. And this censorious effort is coming from the highest levels of the UK's government. In an interview with Sky News, Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that social media is not a law-free zone, and that he wanted to issue a reminder to everyone that whether you're directly involved or whether you're remotely involved, you're culpable, and you will be put before the courts if you've broken the law. And guys, the arrests have already begun. As Sky News reports, one 28-year-old man, Jordan Parler, has been sentenced to 20 months in prison after writing on Facebook, "Every man and his dog should smash the F out of Britannia Hotel in Leeds," even though his post only received 6 likes, and there's no evidence that anybody actually saw it who went on to go attack the hotel, or that they did so because of his posts. For context, guys, this hotel was being targeted because it was housing refugees at taxpayer expense. Meanwhile, according to The Guardian, a 55-year-old woman was arrested simply for sharing inaccurate information about the suspect involved with the horrific stabbing attack that kicked off all these uprisings. And guys, more arrests are sure to follow. There's just no word for this other than dystopian. The United Kingdom's government is actually going full speech police and arresting people simply for the things they say or that they post online. Of course, anybody who actually is participating in the rioting and the looting and the crimes should be arrested and should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Whether it's the BLM people in 2020 in the US or these anti-immigration protesters in the UK right now, violence and victimizing innocent people is never an acceptable form of protest and is always something the government should crack down on. But going beyond that and actually arresting people for their words, for their speech crimes, now that's just beyond the pale. I mean, for one thing, you are quite literally punishing people for the actions of others, which alone makes this whole thing unjust. Because even in the more extreme cases, like the guy who did with his foolish words encourage violence and the guy he was arrested for it, he did so while he was sitting at home, right? He didn't throw a single brick, he didn't smash a single window, he was not involved in the actual acts, the actual crimes. Nobody was compelled to somehow take an action or do something just because of the stupid shit he posted on Facebook. So to punish him so severely because of the actions of others isn't okay. It's not fair. You're not only unjustly punishing him, but you're also partially removing the blame from the individuals who have agency, who actually chose to commit those acts, and instead lumping it onto the shoulders of somebody miles away who posted dumb things on Facebook. And in the case of the 55-year-old woman and the others like her, to arrest people simply for sharing inaccurate information is insane and incredibly, incredibly dangerous. For context, in this case, the riots and some of the criminal uprisings were kicked off in part because of false rumors that the guy who committed the mass stabbing attack was an illegal immigrant, which was not actually true. And yes, to be clear, people absolutely have a responsibility to be careful with their words and not spread false information. But that's a moral and civic responsibility, not a legal obligation, or at least it certainly shouldn't be. Because crossing into the territory of arresting people and prosecuting them for sharing inaccurate information requires making the government the ultimate arbiter of truth. What could possibly go wrong, right, guys? I mean, of course, as we've been repeatedly over and over again reminded just in the last few years, the government is not all-knowing. And even when it does have good intentions, it often gets things wrong. Just ask the many people who challenged the US government's position on everything from the lab leak theory of COVID's origins, the efficacy of mask mandates, and so many other things related to the COVID-19 pandemic. They were all initially labeled as people pushing fake news and misinformation, but you know what? A lot of the things they were saying turned out to be true, or at least turned out to potentially be true and not necessarily be incorrect. I mean, guys, government officials are only human, and they're just not capable of determining one truth with anywhere near the degree of certainty that would be required to somehow justly punish people for sharing things that are false. But more importantly, all of that presumes good intentions, which in the case of the government is not a presumption we can make. Granting the government this kind of power of policing false information is so dangerous because that power is so incredibly ripe for abuse. I mean, the government does this all the time, where they intentionally try to lie about things or mislead the public or obfuscate facts on things that harm their public perception or look bad for the government and the actions that it's taken. For an example, just look at the Washington Post's Afghanistan papers, extensive reporting they did documenting the many ways that high-ranking US officials lied, misled, and covered up the truth about how the US war in Afghanistan was going for years. They did that, frankly, to cover their ass. And the whole time there were people saying, no, that's not true, or this isn't accurate, or here's what's really happening. And all of that was labeled by the government as false. Turns out they were largely correct, but of course, if the government's the ultimate arbiter of truth, those people could have been arrested or prosecuted for sharing false information about the US war effort. Is that really the kind of society people want to live in? And even if the government were able to somehow accurately determine the truth with a high degree of certainty, what's true, what's fake, what's false, and even if they were never to abuse that power, which I don't think is possible, but let's say, this would still create an enormous chilling effect on a population. What do I mean by that? Well, people would quite understandably be afraid to speak their mind and say what they actually believe publicly because they'd be worried about getting arrested or facing an investigation for accidentally saying something untrue or false in the government's view. And this kind of repressed society is not compatible with the idea of democracy, where the best ideas are supposed to win out over time through the open exchange of arguments and information. It also endangers everything from scientific progress to entrepreneurial innovation, all of which requires the freedom to be wrong. The conclusion here is so clear to me. Yes, of course, the United Kingdom's government must crack down on lawlessness and violence in its streets. But in the long run, its creep towards these truly Orwellian levels of censorship is a far, far bigger threat to its people than any uprising in the street or individual criminal act. And once again, guys, this is a common theme whenever I discuss Canada or the UK or other similar Western nations that don't have our same free speech protections. But this kind of thing is why we Americans should be so incredibly and profoundly grateful for our First Amendment. Because without strict legal protections for free speech, even Western, supposedly advanced democratic societies can descend into this kind of dystopia. That's just my take on all the madness going on in the UK right now. I want to hear from you guys about it if you have anything to add, especially if you're British and you watch my show. What do you think of the riots and the protests and the uprising? And more importantly, what do you think about the government's response and it policing and telling people to be careful what they post? To me, it's Orwellian, it's giving Big Brother, but if you guys feel differently, I do want to hear from you, and I won't report any of your comments to the police. Up next, it's time for Brad versus TikTok, my daily segment where I take on the craziest ideas from across the clock app.
Pronoun of the day is slugs.
Make sure you've subscribed if you haven't yet, and do remember to hit that like button as we go along to reward my suffering through the absolute depths of stupidity that is TikTok. Today, we're going to take a look at a kind of wacky video from one TikToker who apparently thinks that not only should the Second Amendment not exist in our Constitution as we know it, but also that America itself shouldn't exist? Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to hear her out, I guess.
Should the Second Amendment never have been passed? Well, our country as a whole shouldn't exist, so yes, it should never have been passed. Europeans of any kind should never have taken it upon themselves to rule in a land that wasn't theirs. But laying that aside, I wish the Founding Fathers had put a lot more care into the language of the Second Amendment. I know it's not reasonable to expect that the Founding Fathers would understand the future of weaponry, but they could have been more specific in describing the type of firearm that they were actually talking about, instead of leaving it open for interpretation. But again, setting that aside, we could fix it today. We should be a whole lot less concerned about what a small group of white men thought 200 years ago, and more concerned about what a wide swath of citizens want today.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here from our friend who you may recognize from past segments is kind of one of the OGs of TikTok terrible takes. She gives us so much to work with, and for that, we do have to be grateful. But it is wild to hear someone with the audacity to say, America should not exist, while being an American, sitting in one of the most free and prosperous societies to ever exist in all of human history, enjoying all the benefits of that, and then having the audacity to say our country should not exist. Girl, get the out then. Go somewhere else. We should deport you. We can voluntarily deport yourself, and then we can take your citizenship and give it to some immigrant who wants to come here and work hard and love our country. I hate this attitude. I think our country is flawed and imperfect in a lot of ways, but the core is beautiful and good. And the problem is we haven't always lived up to it. Not that we as at our core are bad or somehow shouldn't exist. I find that attitude and idea totally wrong-headed and honestly revolting. I mean, by this logic that, well, the US, was formed by colonists who took land from Native Americans. Oh, so a country that was formed through some form of conquest or taking of land has no right to exist, then, babe, most modern countries can't exist by that logic. It's just, unfortunately, that was the way of the world for many centuries and millennia. So obviously, a lot of what was done to the Native American people was wrong, and it should have been done very differently. And we should have incorporated them into the societies that were being built, and we should have respected their autonomy and allowed them to self-govern in more ways and have their own territories and maybe built the country around the parts that were occupied. I mean, huge swaths of it were totally unoccupied, to be clear. And they didn't really have the same concepts of property ownership that we did. So there's nothing to this notion that the whole continent was just off limits, already claimed. Like, that's ridiculous. But we certainly shouldn't have, and I shouldn't say we, because obviously none of us had anything to do with it, but like the original colonists should not have killed them or given them smallpox blankets or any of the evil things that were done. Though unfortunately, a vast majority of the deaths were honestly just caused by diseases and the bringing over of germs and bacteria and diseases that their immune systems weren't able to handle because they had been totally separated from European society and everything else. And while some of that was obviously worsened by the horrific things that were done, like giving of smallpox blankets and kind of purposefully using diseases as a weapon, a huge amount of death and despair was kind of inevitable when these civilizations met, simply because of those biological factors. But of course, I'm going on a tangent here, but of course, it should have been handled totally differently, and a lot of terrible things were done. But that doesn't change the fact that those people went on to create and lay the foundations for one of the most free and prosperous human civilizations ever known to mankind. And that is still ultimately a good thing. I genuinely don't understand the kind of short-termism or historical ignorance and illiteracy it requires to believe that the US is somehow fundamentally bad or shouldn't exist. Like, can you not understand that as an American in the year of our Lord 2024, you have rights and freedoms and opportunities that even now 95+% of the world would envy, but in the broader context of human history, of all of mankind, you are in the 99.99 percentile of most privileged and blessed people ever to be in this country. And yet we have people like this who disdain it and honestly want to tear it all up. And I find that completely alien and completely baffling. And the analysis of the Second Amendment in this TikTok is just laughably ignorant. Like, of course, the founding fathers didn't specifically list what weaponry they meant to protect, because that wasn't the point. The idea was to enshrine a concept, a constitutional right to self-defense with commonly available weaponry that would then carry on through the centuries as weaponry evolved. The same way the First Amendment, this person would surely agree, protects their TikTok account and the internet, even though, of course, the founding fathers couldn't have imagined the new forms of speech that technology would bring to us. So to say, this whole, well, they only could have imagined muskets when they wrote that on paper, betrays a total ignorance of how the founders viewed the Constitution as establishing a set of ideals and principles to then be applied to the future, not outlining specific laws that were to govern the US for all of its future. Of course not. And there's actually the most scary part of this video is when this person seems to suggest that simple majority rule should somehow override our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. It's totally civically illiterate, because the very point of the Bill of Rights attached to our Constitution is to serve as a guard against the dangers of the tyranny of the majority, of unfettered pure democracy. Some things are supposed to be off limits, particularly individual rights. Because if all you need is 51% of the public or 60% of the public to agree on something, and then it's okay to violate individual rights, like the freedom of speech or like the right to bear arms in self-defense, then you don't actually have rights at all. And it's funny to hear people like this say this, because they of all should know. I mean, this person has insanely radical takes on many things that probably less than 10% of Americans would agree with. Yet their right to say those takes and not be squelched or shut down is protected by the First Amendment, which is anti-democratic, anti-majoritarian. Yet she seems to think that the majority rule should just override that. Babe, you would literally be on the wrong end of that equation on many issues. Honestly, videos like this take me back to a common theme I've said for a long time. We have a desperate issue of civic and constitutional illiteracy in our country, and we need to really reinstate and reinforce civics education in this country. So many people are ignorant. Some people don't understand our Constitution, our founders, the framing of our system of government, and it shows, especially on TikTok, but just honestly all around us in general life, it shows. Well, what do you guys think of this video? And do you agree with me about the need for more civic education? Do let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like button to reward my suffering through the depths of stupidity that I'm constantly stumbling into on TikTok. And now, I'll read a few of your comments from the last episode before we wrap up for the week. One person writes that I think pole vaulting has shown us that actually your genitals can impact your ability to compete. Yeah, you're right, actually. I've seen that clip. And apparently GLAAD in their little information guide and language guide was mistaken when they said that genitals have no bearing on your impact to compete. So they should really issue a correction in light of these seismic events. Another person said, WTF has GLAAD got to do with the Olympics? You know, my friend, I have no clue. Your guess is as good as mine, but they're just constantly inserting themselves into everything and trying to butt in and say, actually, you can't say that, or actually, the right way to say that is this. And it's the most annoying, smarmy approach to activism and politics, but it's unfortunately kind of what GLAAD is known for these days. Another person says, the girl with the I trained my dog to be racist towards white people used to be one of my best friends in college. Her and I, despite being on opposite sides of the aisle, would be able to have civil conversations. Ever since some personal things happened in her life, I have lost complete contact with her. It's sad to see because she was such a genuine person who was anti-racism in any way. I hope one day we may be able to reconnect. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing. That must be kind of wild to be just watching my show and then someone you know pops up in the TikTok reactions. That's kind of nuts, but that is really sad. And I also hope that she can kind of see the light and realize she's gone astray and come back to I mean, you could still be a progressive. I'm not saying she needs to come be a right winger, but I'm saying you just shouldn't be actively teaching your dog to hate white people. Like, maybe that's actually not okay. Another person said, math is not a verb. Excuse me, but I identify as math being a verb. And I think it's kind of fun to say your math isn't mathing. So I'm going to keep saying it. And if you don't like it, you can call the grammar police. All right, everybody, that is it for this episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast. Thank you so much for joining me and tuning in. Do remember to hit that like button before you go. Comment with your thoughts. I do read the comments. And with that, we'll talk again next week.